Emotional Elicitation, Prediction, and Anti-Universalism, some Prolegomena to Emotional Artificial Intelligence. In the following pages, I first identify some of the means by which we predict emotions, focusing on eliciting conditions. I then briefly outline some difficulties that complexities of emotion inference are likely to cause for AI. I draw on some recent criticisms by Vigliensoni and Fiebrink, by Mao and colleagues, and especially by Lisa Feldman Barrett, criticisms of common methods in AI design. This leads me to a brief example drawn from contemporary art music. Having connected part of my argument with Barrett's work, I conclude with a critical response to Barrett's culturalist objections to emotional AI. Eliciting conditions for emotion episodes. When we refer to emotions in English, we typically have one of several alternatives in mind. The most prototypical of these is probably an emotion episode, a fit of anger, a moment of fear, and so on. Emotion episodes are short-term, intense experiences of one or more emotions and are differentiated from dispositions of character and from mood states. I will leave the latter to aside, though they clearly play a role in emotion prediction. Within emotion episodes, the main component relevant to prediction is eliciting conditions. The situations that give rise to an emotion episode. Eliciting conditions themselves have two components: situational features, as construed by the person whose emotion is being predicted, the recipient, as I will call him or her, and sensitivities of that recipient. Construed situational features are keyed to a recipient's sensitivities, which may be innate as such or innately prepared, thus ready for accelerated learning, often by way of emotion contagion from facial, postural, tactile, vocal, or other signals from caregivers. For example, the ready acquisition of a fear of snakes is often discussed in terms of preparation. Recipient sensitivities may also derive from critical period experiences. For example, the development of an infant's attachment bonding involves idiosyncratic features along with features that form standard patterns in attachment security, all of which can have consequences throughout life, especially in cases of trauma. Finally, recipient sensitivity is affected by later, less determinative post-critical period memories, especially so-called emotional memories, that is, memories which not only include representational content, but also reactivate the associated emotion when recalled. Clearly, there is considerable complexity in the eliciting conditions for emotions, to the extent that it is very difficult to identify what these eliciting conditions are in any given case. This complexity is only exacerbated by research on the operation of the brain in emotion. Neurological research shows us that some areas of the brain are particularly, though by no means uniquely, associated with some emotions. Thus, fear is particularly connected with the amygdala, as is anger, while disgust is linked regularly with the insula, as is hunger. Additionally, a number of emotions are associated with particular neurochemicals, such as oxytocin with attachment. Further complications arise from the fact that some of the emotions to which we refer by simple nouns, thus in ways that make it appear that these are simple or basic emotions, are in fact compilations of two or more emotions. For example, romantic love comprises attachment, reward, and sexual desire. To make matters worse, the proportions of the components can change, not only across cases, but from day to day in a particular case. Moreover, even the constituents need not be basic. For example, the reward system, a constituent of romantic love, has a seeking component connected with dopamine and a culminative or pleasure component connected with endogenous opioids. A further complication is that in self-conscious humans, emotions commonly give rise to meta-emotions. For example, shame at being moved to tears. These may alter the course. These may alter the course of the emotion episode. This is not only a problem in everyday life. The situation becomes even more convoluted when we enter the realm of art. Specifically, I have argued that the emotional experience of aesthetic delight is a composite of emotional and cognitive components. The cognitive components derive from the three types of categorization that we employ and consist in rule abstraction, prototype approximation, and exemplar resemblance. The emotional components consist in interest, alternatively absence of habituation, and attachment system engagement. Though I know of no criticisms of emotional AI that address these aesthetic issues specifically, the relation of AI to aesthetics has not gone unnoticed. For example, Vigliensoni and Fiebrink argued recently that music composers cannot hope to convey their intentions via interactions with AI systems trained on massive data sets. They therefore urge that the systems be trained on smaller, more individualized data sets. This is a reasonable suggestion and addresses part of the complexity problem, as that problem impacts art. Even so, it seems in the end to defeat the purpose of data-driven composition, simply returning the issue of creation to the skill of the individual composer. Moreover, the results do not strike me as terribly promising. Consider Anne Reggae's laptopera, Electra, to which Vigliensoni and Fiebrink refer positively. The AI system should presumably have provided Hege with some indication of how to avoid the obtrusive banality of Apollo's monologue, the awkward metaphors of the chorus, and other problems. It should have led the composer instead to a work of the subtle power of, say, Caroline Shaw's And So, which I thought of immediately on hearing Electra, despite their obvious differences. Some of the problems with Electra may seem relatively straightforward to resolve, for example, by keying the learning of the system to attachment. But other, often more encompassing problems, for example, how do we predict attachment system activation in the first place, are far from straightforward. Shaw's piece is elliptical in that it surrounds many of its chords with silences. I'll play you a little. This is right from the beginning. Those are the opening 6 chords of that piece. Thereby partially discouraging habituation to chord progressions, which are in any event not presented in their canonical forms. This discouraging of habituation is reinforced by shifts in tempi, alternations between slow bowed sections, and almost savage pizzicato sections. The fashioning of musical sequences that avoid habituation but still allow rule abstraction, thereby enabling aesthetic pleasure, is part of the value we place in creativity. Though they were researching metaphorical expression, not music, it is perhaps relevant that Mao and colleagues found that ChatGPT was less creative than humans in the generation and use of metaphor. If generalizable to other sorts of creativity, this may suggest one reason why Shaw's piece is more creative in this sense than is Hege's. In addition, the lyrics of And So are both highly metaphorical and highly elusive. Both features contribute to rule-governed novelty as well. This is due to the ways in which the lyrics play off of familiar verses but alter them, all the while suggesting themes of attachment loss. thereby engaging the attachment system, at least for a particular class of auditors, including myself. Moreover, the listeners are able to abstract rule coherence, not only for the music itself, but also for the music in combination with the lyrics, as when the two final pizzicato sections are identifiable as marking the progress and indeed the threatening acceleration of time, just after time is mentioned in the lyrics. If we have time, I'll play a little section from the very end of the piece. There are sections of this short piece that move me to tears, but I suspect that the usual methods of training composition systems would be relatively unsuccessful at predicting this result. My concerns about the current ability of AI to predict emotions in ecologically valid ways were most similar to the concerns of Barrett. Barrett addresses the related issue of emotion identification, which relates to emotion expression in roughly the way emotion prediction relates to eliciting conditions. For example, in a 2024 lecture criticizing the methodology of emotional AI, Barrett began by stressing that human emotion expression is highly variable. Most of the time when we are angry, we do not present an angry face, and many times when we have an quote, angry face, we are not angry. Though Barrett does not put the point this way, we could say that due to politeness and other considerations, we often do not express the emotion we are feeling, but mask it with something else. Even when we do express the emotion we are experiencing, we might do so indirectly, for example, via an ironic presentation of its opposite. Finally, even if our emotion expression is sincere and direct, it typically constitutes a communicative outcome of our emotion episode only as part of an ensemble of expressive features, including facial gestures, posture, gait, tone of voice, respiration, heartbeat, words, nonverbal vocalizations such as sobs, and so on. Barrett and I part company, however, when she concludes that this is fundamentally a problem with the universalism of AI. But the problem sketched in the preceding comments results from some emotional AI research assuming that emotion expression is sincere, direct, and singular in the sense of being expressed solely through facial gesture. Barrett, however, takes the problem to result significantly from emotional AI not taking cultural difference into account. In discussing her argument with audience members, she comments that these cultural differences are often vast, as when we think of fear as giving rise to the avoidance of danger, quote, but in other cultures, like Bali, for example, the stereotypic response to fear is to fall asleep, unquote. Here, Feldman draws on her 2020 book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, where she focuses specifically on this single case, not adducing any others. I will conclude by discussing some serious problems with her claim, and thus with the cultural constructionism that she defends in that book. Barrett begins her chapter treating cultural construction by highlighting this case in the opening sentence. Quote, when people from the island of Bali in Indonesia are afraid, they fall asleep, unquote. She admits this sounds strange. After all, quote, if you're from a Western culture, you're supposed to freeze or run away. But these are, quote, or just, quote, Western stereotypes for proper fear behavior, unquote. In contrast, in Bali, the stereotype is to fall asleep, quote, unquote. So the Balinese are encultured so radically differently from Europeans that when they feel fear, rather than running away or freezing or fighting, they take a nap. What could be more incomprehensible, more contradictory with our intuitions about emotion universality? Suppose readers who are Westerners imagine themselves faced with an immediate physical threat, such as a wolf. It seems impossible that they would slip into their PJs, brush their teeth, and sink into a restful slumber. One might be forgiven for wondering if Barrett's rhetorical treatment of this point relies for its success on what Michelle Moody Adams refers to as the, quote, fetishism of strangeness and the, quote, exoticism of relativism. Indeed, in her lecture, Barrett goes further. Again, there she asserts that, quote, in other cultures like Bali, for example, the stereotypic response to fear is to fall asleep, unquote. But neither in the book nor in the lecture does Barrett give any reason to believe that this understanding of fear is to be found outside of Bali. If readers want some evidence of her claim, they may turn to the appendix of her book, where Barrett gives brief accounts of the sources for some of her assertions throughout the book. In this case, she explains that she took the example from an article by Mesquita and Frida. She does not mention that Mesquita and Frida's article treats cross-cultural patterns in emotion as well as cultural differences, nor does she explain that Mesquita and Frida find the cross-cultural patterns in central features of emotion proper, including actional outcomes that result from the emotion episode, quote, such as attack and flight, unquote, quoting Mesquita and Frida. Thus, in the features that give emotions their evolutionary functions, precisely what Barrett asserts is not universal in this case. The differences more often occur in more peripheral areas, such as the degree of modulation through which people express emotion. Barrett then states that Bateson and Mead report that, quote, people who lived in Bali would often fall asleep when faced with events that were unfamiliar or frightening. Note how this differs from the statement in the body of the chapter and in the 2024 lecture. Here she is only claiming that Balinese, quote, often, unquote, doze off, a behavior that she does not imply is typical. Moreover, the eliciting conditions for this response are no longer a matter of being afraid, but of witnessing something that is either frightening or simply unfamiliar. This is further weakened to the statement that, quote, according to Bateson and Mead, sleeping was a socially approved response to fear, unquote. This merely tells us that in some circumstances, Balinese people view it as acceptable to fall asleep when one has witnessed something that gave one a fright, to interpret her preceding sentence as telling us how she is using the word fear. Barrett does acknowledge that Bateson and Mead sought to make sense of this Balinese fear response, and she states that, quote, their interpretation was that the people were avoiding something scary. This is roughly what Bateson and Mead assert, using a loosely psychoanalytic framework. Mead's treatment of this topic occurs in the context of her treatment of a dramatic enactment, in which, she tells us, the characters and the actors fall into, quote, trances. Here one might wonder if their supposedly fear-triggered sleep would be better understood as fear-triggered trance. Indeed, this appears to fit with an example of the emotion given by Mead, when, quote, people on the scene of an accident sit in paralyzed semi-stupor, unquote. That's a quote from Margaret Mead. In any case, there are two issues here. First, the adaptive function of fear can be satisfied only by increasing the likelihood that one avoids danger. Second, falling asleep may achieve that goal if it operates like fainting, so that the person appears already dead. My immediate reaction to a case of this sort is to say that something about the original emotion has been misunderstood. Suppose we have decided that a given emotion term in another culture refers to fear. However, this foreign fear does not satisfy the functional requirement that should give the fundamental explanation for the existence of fear. I would then say that we either have made a mistake in translating the foreign term as fear, or we have made some mistake about the functional properties of this emotion. In the Balinese case, then, I would say that either one, the relevant phrase in Balinese, translated by Mead as, quote, in a fright, asleep, does not refer to fear, or 2, the function of the response is misrepresented as, quote, falling asleep. One of those two seem to me to have to be mistaken. Barrett does not discuss anything along these lines. However, for a reader who is not satisfied with the rather thin treatment given in the appendix, just a single paragraph, Barrett provides a third level of discussion, a web page, the address of which must be typed into one's browser from the single paragraph on this topic in the book's appendix. If the reader goes to that website, as I imagine few readers are inclined to do, he or she finds a passage reproduced from Bateson and Mead's book, along with 2 brief comments. The first comment concerns an article by James Russell, where he points out that a Balinese word ordinarily translated as fright is actually, quote, sharply distinguished from fear, referring instead to an unpleasant, unexpected experience that is, quote, beyond choice or personal responsibility, unlike the Balinese equivalent for fear. This seems to suggest an inevitable development that one cannot do anything about, and that might reasonably manifest itself anywhere in lying down, even falling asleep. After all, if there's nothing you can do about it, running away won't help. If the feeling is future-oriented, we might call it despair or resignation. If past-oriented, it is actually related to one use of the word fright in English, as when someone says, I have to lie down for a moment, I just had a terrible fright. It is also worth noting that Barrett misquotes Mead's translation. Again, Mead writes, quote, in a fright, comma, asleep, which suggests that these are 2 meanings of the word. In contrast, Barrett writes, quote, in a fright sleep. In changing fright from a noun to an adjective that modifies sleep, Barrett draws a causal connection between the fear and the somnolence. Some weeks after reading this, I read Bram Stoker's Dracula. In that novel, Jonathan Harker has some emotionally devastating experiences with Dracula while in Transylvania. On returning to England, he spies Dracula and is, quote, terrified, unquote. He leaves the place with Mina. Then, quote, his eyes closed and he went quickly into a sleep, unquote. Fear leading to sleep, though Stoker was not Balinese. Later, Minna refers to Jonathan's experience as, quote, shock, unquote, which is virtually a synonym for fright in this context. Unsurprisingly, Barrett does not draw the sorts of conclusions I have just drawn, nor does she acknowledge that Russell's account is inconsistent with her claims about the standard understanding of fear in Bali. Indeed, she somehow interprets Russell's statements as pointing toward the incompatibility of European and Balinese understandings of fear. Specifically, which she refers to, quote, the Balinese equivalent for the Western stereotype for fear, unquote, apparently suggesting that the Balinese have a word meaning what they understand as fear, plus a further word for roughly the stereotype Westerners have in mind when they say fear. She does ultimately acknowledge that there is a connection between Balinese somnolence and fainting, though it is buried deep in a website separate from her book and is heavily qualified as bearing, quote, some resemblance, unquote. This is still quite distant from the statement with which Barrett began her chapter and repeated on the occasion of her lecture. The confident, shocking assertion of an unequivocal and extreme instance of cultural divergence and emotion that, it seemed, should be enough to make us dismiss theories of human universality out of hand. In short, I believe that Barrett is right to question the methodology of emotional AI when she argues that methodology requires a more adequate understanding of emotion. In the first half of this talk, I sought to outline some key aspects of such understanding as they bear on the predictive capacities of emotional AI. However, in the second half, I took up Barrett's culturalist claims against AI, which I believe to be more profoundly misguided than any of the presuppositions of emotional AI she sets out to criticize. but here, let me play you the ending of and so.
And so we stay on borrowed time.
Thank you.